It began with a clip never intended for public eyes, a few seconds of footage that palace insiders allegedly described as deeply inappropriate for royal grounds. Within hours, corridors once open to trusted guests turned silent. Then came the order that stunned even veteran staff. Every accommodation privilege linked to Camilla's extended circle was under review, and Prince William, usually measured, reportedly refused to reconsider. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, the whispers were treated as palace folklore, the kind of rumor that appears for a day, sparks a dozen private conversations, and disappears beneath the polished routines of royal life. But according to reports circulating among royal commentators and various interpretations offered by palace observers, this story refused to fade. Instead, it spread with unusual speed, not because of what the footage allegedly showed, but because of where it was said to have been recorded and who was believed to have had access. The recording itself was never publicly authenticated. No official statement confirmed its existence. No palace office acknowledged details. Yet among those who closely track the internal mechanics of royal households, the silence reportedly became louder than any denial could have been. What allegedly emerged behind closed doors was not immediate outrage, it was concern. Concern about access. Concern about protocol. Concern about whether invisible lines that had protected royal boundaries for generations had become blurred in ways nobody wanted to admit publicly. Sources frequently cited by royal watch circles have long suggested that private accommodation inside royal residences carries meaning far beyond convenience. Rooms are not merely rooms. Guest access is not simply hospitality. Every arrangement reflects hierarchy, trust, proximity, and in some interpretations, legitimacy. Which is why insiders allegedly became unsettled when questions surfaced about how informal privilege may have evolved into something appearing institutional. Reports suggest that senior household officials moved quickly once awareness of the situation reached upper levels. Administrative reviews reportedly began quietly. Accommodation schedules were revisited. Existing permissions were allegedly examined with unusual urgency. Then came the detail that accelerated speculation. Multiple interpretations of internal timelines suggested Prince William was informed before any wider household discussion reached public awareness. Observers who have followed William's increasingly disciplined approach to royal operations claim that this mattered enormously, because if accurate, it suggested the response was never treated as scandal management, it was treated as governance. And according to recurring palace speculation, that distinction changed everything. Rather than dramatic confrontations or visible displays of frustration, what reportedly followed was colder, structured, controlled. Accommodation privileges connected to extended access circles allegedly stopped moving forward. Temporary stays reportedly paused. Administrative approvals slowed. Requests entered review. Staff who normally understood the rhythm of palace logistics allegedly found themselves receiving fewer explanations than usual. Several commentators later described the atmosphere as unusually restrained, not chaotic, not emotional, but deliberate. That silence created its own narrative. Questions multiplied. Why such caution? Why such speed? Why respond with institutional mechanisms instead of public clarification? Some observers argued this reflected broader changes already taking shape inside royal operations. Others interpreted it as evidence that future leadership styles were becoming visible earlier than expected. And underneath every theory sat one uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps this was never about one recording at all. Because if access could be questioned once, then access itself had become the story. And suddenly, what had once appeared permanent no longer looked untouchable. But removing access wasn't just punishment, it reopened an old question inside royal circles. Who truly belongs inside the walls of monarchy? Royal residences are not hotels. They are symbols, privileges, and silent declarations of trust, which made what happened next feel less like housekeeping and more like exile. Inside royal tradition, accommodation has never simply meant a place to sleep. Those granted access to residences tied to the crown are not receiving convenience. They are receiving recognition. For generations, the difference has mattered. Royal households have operated through systems that rarely need public explanation, because the meaning is understood internally. A room assignment can say more than an official statement. A recurring invitation can become a signal of confidence. Continued access can quietly elevate a person's standing without a single title being changed. That is why, according to palace watchers and longtime royal observers, the reaction to the alleged recording created immediate discomfort far beyond concerns over privacy. Because once questions emerge around who enters protected spaces, another question follows close behind who approved it, and under what understanding. Reports and interpretations circulating through royal commentary suggested that discussions quickly moved away from the content of the footage itself. The conversation reportedly became institutional. Access logs, hosting customs, long-standing arrangements, informal permissions, tiny administrative habits that had accumulated over years and now, according to speculation, suddenly looked different under scrutiny. Historically, royal households have guarded these boundaries with unusual discipline. Observers frequently point to earlier periods of tightened control during moments of transition. Whenever succession pressures increased, whenever public trust weakened, or whenever internal tensions surfaced, proximity often became the first privilege to quietly change. Doors remained closed, guest lists narrowed, traditions returned. Not publicly, not dramatically, simply through process. That history is why some commentators interpreted the reported lodging reviews as carrying a message beyond administration. Official access and unofficial familiarity have always existed side by side inside royal life. There are those connected through office, and those connected through relationships. Most of the time, the distinction remains manageable. But insiders have often suggested problems begin when informal closeness starts appearing permanent. And according to some interpretations of recent events, that exact concern may have surfaced. The alleged discomfort was not necessarily about any one person. It was about blurred lines. When does private hospitality begin to resemble entitlement? When does trust become expectation? When does family proximity begin to create assumptions of permanence? These are uncomfortable questions because monarchy, by its nature, survives on symbols as much as structures. Reports suggest staff conversations became noticeably restrained. Explanations allegedly became shorter. Administrative language reportedly became more precise. The atmosphere, according to recurring descriptions from royal circles, was not emotional, it was corrective. Because if access had become too casual, then restoring distance could itself become a statement. And suddenly what once looked ordinary began attracting new interpretations. Observers started revisiting old assumptions. Had certain privileges quietly expanded over time? Had temporary arrangements become normalized? Had the institution become more relaxed than its future leadership intended? The questions continued growing, because this no longer appeared connected to one disputed incident. The alleged review of lodging arrangements began looking, to some like part of something larger, a recalibration already underway beneath the surface. And according to palace watchers, William's response had been years in the making. Those who watched William closely claimed this wasn't anger, it was policy. Quietly, methodically, the future king had been redefining where loyalty ended, an institution began. By the time questions surrounding access and accommodation began circulating through palace commentary, some royal observers argued that the response itself should not have been surprising. According to recurring interpretations from people who follow the institution closely, this moment did not emerge from a single event. It emerged from a philosophy, one that had reportedly been developing for years beneath public appearances, ceremonial duties, and carefully managed continuity. William's public image has often been associated with restraint, not dramatic intervention, not emotional declarations. But restraint can sometimes conceal something far more consequential: structure. Reports and commentary over recent years have frequently suggested that the heir's approach to monarchy differs from older traditions of informal flexibility. Where previous generations occasionally relied on personal understanding and inherited rhythms, William has often been described by observers as increasingly focused on systems, accountability, and clearer boundaries. That distinction matters. Because if decisions become institutional rather than personal, then exceptions become harder to justify. And according to interpretations now circulating through royal watch circles, that mindset may explain why the alleged accommodation response appeared unusually firm. Sources and speculation suggest William's role inside royal operations has gradually expanded, not always publicly, but administratively. More briefings, more influence over priorities, more involvement in decisions connected to reputation and long-term stability. None of this has been formally framed as transformation. Yet insiders and commentators alike have repeatedly described signs of a future monarch becoming more visible in the machinery behind the scenes. That evolution reportedly came with a shift in language. Less emphasis on relationships, more emphasis on standards, less concern for preserving old assumptions, more concern for protecting future expectations. Observers have often pointed to a pattern. Moments once treated as isolated incidents increasingly appearing through the lens of institutional consequences. And if those interpretations hold weight, then the alleged reaction to the recording was never simply about discomfort, it was about precedent. Because precedent survives. One accommodation exception becomes another. One informal privilege becomes expectation. One assumption becomes culture. Reports suggest this concern has quietly shaped broader household management in recent years. Administrative structures reportedly became more disciplined. Internal processes allegedly tightened. Access reviews, communication protocols, and representational standards began carrying greater importance than before. Again, none of this was announced. But according to palace commentary, that was precisely the point. The strongest institutional changes rarely arrive with speeches. They arrive through procedures, through forms, through approvals that stop arriving, through traditions that begin returning. That is why some observers described the reported lodging response as less emotional than people expected. There were no dramatic confrontations attached to the story, no public rebukes, no visible campaign. Instead, according to various interpretations, there appeared to be a framework, a question asked repeatedly behind the scenes. Does this strengthen the institution or weaken it? If the answer created uncertainty, then action reportedly followed. That philosophy, whether admired or criticized, has increasingly been described as an institution-first approach. Not family first, not familiarity first, institution first. Supporters interpret it as discipline. Critics interpret it as distance. But even critics reportedly acknowledged one thing. Once decisions begin following systems instead of sentiment, reversing them becomes difficult. And perhaps that was what made the atmosphere feel different. Because if observers were right, then the alleged response was never temporary containment. It was a message. And the reaction inside Camilla's orbit reportedly came faster and sharper than expected. What insiders allegedly expected to be temporary restrictions soon felt permanent. Invitations stalled. Overnight stays disappeared. Familiar routines suddenly ended. At first, according to palace commentary and various interpretations circulating among royal observers, many assumed the atmosphere would settle. Royal institutions have weathered awkward headlines before. Internal reviews happen. Access pauses. Procedures tighten for a period and then gradually soften again. That was reportedly the expectation in some circles surrounding the wider household. But this time, observers began suggesting something felt different. Not louder, not harsher, simply more final. The early assumption, according to recurring commentary, was that any restrictions connected to accommodation or informal access would remain symbolic, a brief correction designed to reinforce standards before returning quietly to normal. Yet as days passed and routines allegedly failed to resume, interpretation shifted. Because in royal life, people rarely notice exclusion through announcements. They notice it through absence. Conversations that do not happen. Calls that stop coming. Arrangements that remain under review. invitations that somehow never materialize. And according to speculation surrounding the period, those signals reportedly became impossible to ignore. Observers claimed the wider social impact began extending beyond logistics. Access inside royal life has always carried layers of meaning. Being nearby creates assumptions. Familiarity creates status. Repetition creates belonging. Over time, informal privileges can become woven into identity itself. Which is why, according to palace watchers, the alleged tightening created emotional consequences far larger than room allocations. People reportedly began asking questions nobody wanted to ask directly. Was this temporary? Was this administrative? Or had the definition of proximity itself quietly changed? Commentary surrounding the situation suggested that what disappeared first were not major ceremonial roles or public appearances. Instead, smaller customs reportedly shifted. Familiar patterns allegedly faded. Informal expectations no longer seemed automatic. To outsiders, those details appear minor. Inside royal ecosystems, they can feel enormous. Because when access changes, perception changes. And when perception changes, influence often changes with it. Reports suggest reactions among palace circles were not unified. Some interpretations described support for stricter boundaries, arguing that institutional clarity protects everyone involved. Others reportedly viewed the approach as unusually cold, warning that symbolic corrections can sometimes create unnecessary distance. That divide itself became part of the story. One side allegedly framed it as responsible stewardship. The other reportedly questioned whether symbolism had become stronger than relationships. Meanwhile, rumors began doing what rumors always do. When silence expands, they multiplied. Commentators speculated. Observers interpreted. External narratives formed faster than internal explanations. Questions spread into broader discussions about the future shape of royal life, and what kind of household would eventually emerge under future leadership. Would familiarity continue carrying influence? Would old habits survive? Would access become increasingly formal? And underneath every version of the story sat one difficult realization. If boundaries were being redrawn, they were being redrawn quietly. No speeches, no declarations, just a growing sense that certain assumptions no longer held. And for those trying to understand whether this represented a passing adjustment or a deeper shift, one uncomfortable truth reportedly became impossible to ignore. This was no longer only about who had lost access. It was becoming about who had the authority to redefine it. Yet behind closed doors, another figure reportedly faced the hardest position of all. If William represented the future, Charles represented the impossible present caught between personal loyalty and the expectations attached to the crown. As speculation surrounding accommodation reviews and shifting access continued to spread, attention reportedly began turning toward the one figure many believed would eventually have to absorb the pressure from every direction at once. Because while public conversation increasingly focused on authority, policy, and the future shape of the institution, there remained another question beneath the surface. What happens when leadership and relationships no longer move at the same pace? According to royal commentary and long-running interpretations of palace dynamics, King Charles has often occupied a uniquely difficult position, one shaped by decades of preparation for the crown, followed almost immediately by the reality that monarchy rarely allows personal simplicity. Reports and observers frequently describe modern royal life as requiring two versions of the same person to exist at once: the individual and the institution. And sometimes those versions want different things. If speculation surrounding recent events reflected reality in any form, then Charles reportedly found himself standing in exactly that space. On one side sat continuity, relationships, familiarity, and the instinct to preserve calm. On the other sat growing pressure to reinforce boundaries, protect public confidence, and support systems that future leadership might consider necessary. Royal commentators have often noted that father and son are perceived differently not necessarily in values, but in style. Charles has frequently been portrayed as patient, adaptive, willing to absorb complexity in order to maintain balance. William, by contrast, is often interpreted as more structured, more decisive, more comfortable, allowing decisions to carry consequences if they protect long-term stability. Neither approach is automatically stronger, but according to palace watchers, moments of institutional pressure make those differences impossible to ignore. Reports suggest that throughout periods of heightened scrutiny, households typically attempt the same thing first: containment. Not resolution, containment. Slow the conversation, reduce interpretation, allow administrative language to replace emotional language. And according to various readings of this period, there were signs of that strategy emerging again. Fewer public signals, no visible disputes, no direct acknowledgement, no confirmation of rumors. But silence can become complicated, because silence reassures some people and unsettles others. The longer explanations fail to arrive, the more meaning observers begin assigning to what is absent. That reportedly became one of the most difficult parts of the moment. Questions of fairness started appearing. If access changes once, does everyone become subject to review? If relationships no longer guarantee continuity, what becomes the new standard? If future expectations shape present decisions, where does flexibility survive? Commentators reportedly divided into familiar camps. Some argued discipline protects institutions. Others warned institutions risk appearing distant when symbolism overtakes humanity. Meanwhile, Charles, at least in public interpretations, remained difficult to read. And perhaps that uncertainty became its own message, because people began noticing something unusual. Not intervention, not reversal, not visible resistance, only continuation, which some interpreted as support, others interpreted as acceptance, and some viewed as recognition that certain decisions once introduced become harder to undo than to approve. That possibility created a deeper kind of tension, not dramatic conflict, something quieter. The realization that transitions do not begin the day a crown changes hands. Sometimes they begin years earlier in expectations, habits, and the decisions nobody officially explains. And if that interpretation was correct, then the conversation had already moved beyond accommodation, beyond one alleged incident, beyond temporary restrictions. It had become a question of what the institution would permit from now on. And then came the move insiders described as irreversible. What appeared administrative on paper allegedly carried the force of a public declaration. Access, once granted quietly, could disappear just as quietly. By the time speculation reached this stage, many observers no longer described the reported changes as temporary adjustments. According to palace commentary and various interpretations circulating among royal watch circles, something had shifted in tone. The language surrounding the situation reportedly became less about reaction and more about process, less about one disputed moment and more about structure. And structure, inside royal life, often outlasts emotion. Reports suggested that accommodation reviews, once interpreted as precautionary, began being discussed as something more formal. Not dramatic removals, not visible confrontation. Instead, what allegedly emerged was a pattern familiar to anyone who studies institutions: review, reassessment, recalibration. It sounded ordinary. That was exactly why some commentators believed it mattered. Because institutions rarely announce their strongest decisions. They normalize them. According to interpretations of the atmosphere, this was where the story reportedly became difficult to reverse. When access changes remain informal, they can be quietly restored. But once procedures begin appearing around those changes, once reviews become expectations, and expectations become standards, the meaning evolves. Observers began suggesting that what looked procedural carried symbolic weight far beyond accommodation itself. A room had never been just a room. A stay had never been just convenience. Inside royal culture, proximity can represent confidence, continuity, and acceptance, which meant reduced access could also be interpreted as something else entirely. Distance. That interpretation spread quickly. Reports suggested palace conversations increasingly referenced broader concerns around security, privacy, consistency, and image. Not necessarily because of any one individual or event, but because institutions under scrutiny often become more cautious about everything connected to trust. Who enters? Who hosts? Who stays? Who appears to belong? According to some observers, that broader logic became central. If standards tighten in one area, can exceptions survive elsewhere? If future leadership intends clearer boundaries, does old flexibility still fit? Those questions reportedly transformed administrative decisions into something that felt larger than administration. Commentators began describing the alleged changes as resembling internal restructuring, not public restructuring, not constitutional change, but a quieter realignment of assumptions. Old habits reviewed, informal practices reconsidered, unwritten expectations challenged. And whether fair or not, people started attaching meaning to those developments. Supporters interpreted the reports as institutional discipline finally becoming visible. Critics questioned whether symbolism risked becoming too powerful. Yet even disagreement seemed to point toward the same conclusion. Something was becoming clearer. Authority. Not announced. Not declared. Visible. According to recurring commentary, one reason the alleged response attracted attention was because it appeared to reveal who was increasingly shaping the future culture of royal operations. Not through speeches, not through public intervention, through process, through standards, through decisions that quietly remained in place. That interpretation gave the entire situation a different tone. Because if observers were correct, this was no longer merely about containing fallout. It was becoming an institutional reset. And resets rarely feel dramatic while they are happening. Only afterward do people realize the rules changed. By then, what once felt temporary starts looking permanent. And once that realization spread, attention began moving somewhere unexpected. Because the effects of changing access do not stop at doors. They travel. Into relationships, into influence, into the invisible hierarchy surrounding the crown. But the consequences stretched beyond rooms and guest lists. Royal observers began asking whether this moment would be remembered, not for a video, but for the rules that followed it. Because what started as an isolated controversy, according to palace commentary and layered interpretations from royal watch circles, began to evolve into something far more structural in meaning. Not an incident, not a reaction, but a turning point in how access, trust, and proximity were understood inside the monarchy. And in that shift, the focus slowly moved away from the trigger event itself and toward something far more permanent. Rules, boundaries, expectations. Observers suggested that once a royal institution begins reshaping access culture, it rarely does so in isolation. It affects everything connected to it. Invitations, residences, informal stays, even the invisible etiquette that governs who feels at home within royal spaces and who does not. And according to recurring interpretations, this was where the alleged changes began to feel like something larger than correction. They began to feel like design. Under William's increasingly visible influence, as described by royal commentators and palace watchers, the idea of separating personal familiarity from institutional function reportedly became more pronounced. Not as a public declaration, but as an operating principle. A quiet line drawn between warmth and duty, between family proximity and institutional trust. That distinction, subtle as it sounds, carries enormous weight inside monarchy. Because royal life has always depended on blurred spaces, places where family and institution overlap, where hospitality and authority coexist, where personal relationships soften formal structures. But once those overlaps begin to tighten, everything shifts. Reports and interpretations circulating among observers suggested that this moment represented exactly that kind of tightening. Not rejection of tradition, but refinement of it. A move toward clarity in environments where ambiguity once protected comfort. And with that shift came a new narrative taking shape outside palace walls. Modernization. Discipline. Structure. Words that, depending on perspective, either signal strength or distance. Supporters of this perceived direction argue that monarchy survives only when it evolves, when it becomes more precise about boundaries in an age of scrutiny, where perception can define legitimacy. Critics, however, see something more complicated: a slow cooling of familiarity, where personal bonds become secondary to institutional optics. Both interpretations, however, converge on one point. The center of gravity is moving. And in that movement, future expectations under William increasingly come into focus. Not as a break from tradition, but as a recalibration of what tradition allows. A monarchy that is still rooted in continuity, yet more deliberate about where continuity ends and access begins. In this emerging narrative, accommodation, hospitality, and proximity are no longer just gestures of goodwill. They are extensions of institutional identity. And that identity, according to observers, is being shaped around clarity rather than flexibility. What remains uncertain is how this shift will be remembered. As necessary evolution, or as the moment when something intangible inside royal life changed forever. Because legacy in monarchy is never built only through visible acts. It is also built through silent restructures, through decisions that feel administrative in the moment, but symbolic in hindsight. And as these interpretations spread, one question began to linger more than others. Not what happened, but what it meant for everything that comes next. And in the end, the palace offered no dramatic announcement, only something colder. No speeches, no confrontations, no public reckoning, just doors that allegedly stopped opening, and a message many believed was impossible to miss. In royal tradition, silence has always carried its own language. It does not announce itself. It does not demand attention. It simply settles into the spaces where certainty used to exist, leaving interpretation to grow in its place. And according to palace watchers and long-circulated interpretations of institutional behavior, that silence often arrives not as absence, but as transition. What made this moment feel different, as suggested by commentary surrounding recent events, was not any single action or statement. It was the absence of reversal, the absence of clarification, the absence of return to what once felt familiar. Because in monarchy, familiarity is not just comfort, it is currency. And when that currency begins to lose circulation, people notice. Reports and interpretations suggest that what followed was not confrontation, but quiet recalibration. Access that once felt automatic reportedly became conditional. Invitations that once signaled belonging began to slow. Spaces that once carried informal warmth allegedly became governed by clearer boundaries, shaped less by personality and more by structure. And yet, nothing was officially declared. That, according to royal observers, was precisely the point. Because the monarchy rarely communicates transformation through direct explanation. It communicates through continuity, through what remains unchanged, and just as importantly, through what no longer does. In that space between change and acknowledgement, meaning forms on its own. William's public image, as discussed widely in commentary and analysis, increasingly reflects that shift toward institutional continuity over individual familiarity, not as rejection of tradition, but as an emphasis on safeguarding it. A belief, according to interpretations, that the crown must remain larger than the relationships surrounding it. Supporters of this view describe it as clarity finally replacing ambiguity, a necessary evolution in an era where perception travels faster than explanation. Critics, however, see something more restrained, even colder: a gradual narrowing of informal space in favor of defined structure. Both readings, in their own way, point to the same reality. The institution is being understood less through personalities and more through boundaries. And boundaries, once established, rarely announce themselves twice. Within that framework, what might appear as quiet administrative change becomes something heavier. Not punishment, not exclusion in the dramatic sense, but redirection, a redefinition of how proximity itself is earned, maintained, or lost. Royal history is filled with moments like this: subtle shifts, that only reveal their significance in hindsight. Moments when doors do not slam, yet still close. When silence does not deny, but confirms. When the absence of explanation becomes the explanation itself. And so, as interpretations spread beyond palace walls, one idea continued to surface again and again, that this was not about a single moment, or a single relationship, or even a single decision. It was about what the institution chooses to preserve when everything else becomes uncertain. Trust, structure, distance, and the discipline to maintain all three at once. In that light, the story stops being about visible action and becomes something more enduring. A question of identity, of legacy, of how monarchy survives not only through presence but through absence carefully managed. Because in the end, what defines royal authority is not always what is said aloud, but what remains understood without ever needing to be spoken. And sometimes the strongest statement in royal life is not who is invited inside, but who quietly discovers they no longer are. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.